April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. To the American soldiers arriving on the beaches of Okinawa, it looked like paradise: emerald water, white coral cliffs, a warm breeze carrying the scent of sugarcane. But beneath that beauty, tens of thousands of civilians were hiding in caves, waiting to die. By the time the battle ended, more than 100,000 Okinawan civilians would be gone. Some burned in the bombings, some starved between the lines, and tens of thousands took their own lives, mothers, fathers, children, not because they wanted to die, but because they were told capture was worse. They believed the Americans would torture them. They believed surrender was treason. They believed death was loyalty. The cliffs of Yaka, Mabuni, and Chibichiri still carry the echoes of that belief, where whole families jumped together, their bodies swallowed by the sea below. And yet, in the diaries that survived, you find words of doubt, words of love, words of ordinary people trapped between two armies and one impossible choice. The United States called Okinawa the dress rehearsal for invasion. Japan called it the line that must never break. But for the people who lived there, it became something else entirely: the island that died with its people. Tonight, we uncover what history rarely tells: how an island of farmers became soldiers, how propaganda became truth, and how a nation's fear turned its own citizens into martyrs. Before the guns, before the ships, before the flags of two nations clashed, Okinawa was an island of peace. Fishermen rose before dawn, casting nets into water so clear you could see the coral 50 feet below. Children walked barefoot to school along stone paths, their lunches wrapped in banana leaves. Old women swept their front steps with straw brooms, humming songs that had been sung since the Ryukyu kingdom, centuries before Japan had claimed the island as its own. Okinawa was closer to Taiwan than to Tokyo in distance and in spirit. Its people spoke a different dialect, followed their own traditions, and saw themselves as neither wholly Japanese nor foreign. For generations, they'd been caught between empires first, China's tribute, then Japan's rule. But nothing in their long history prepared them for what was coming. By 1944, whispers reached the villages the Americans were moving north, one island at a time. Okinawa, Japan's southernmost stronghold, would be next. The Imperial Army arrived long before the invasion, and everything began to change. Farmers were told to dig caves for shelters, then to fortify them with concrete. Fishermen's boats were seized for military use. Schoolyards filled not with laughter, but with shouts from soldiers training boys to fight with bamboo spears. Entire families were ordered to evacuate their homes and live underground. Villages turned into military positions. Caves became hospitals, storage depots, and command posts. The soldiers said it was for protection, but when American planes began flying overhead, the villagers noticed something strange. The army camps were hidden among their homes. The people were shields. To the Japanese commanders, Okinawa wasn't home, it was a barrier. To the Okinawans, it was still their island, the soil of their ancestors. But by the time spring of 1945 came, the island no longer belonged to anyone. It was already claimed by war. The sea was quiet that April morning, but far beyond the horizon, something vast was moving toward them. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. To the villagers hiding in the limestone caves, the rumble came first, a low, rolling thunder that shook the earth. Then the horizon turned black with ships. More than 1,300 American vessels stretched as far as the eye could see. It was the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War. Men from Iowa, Texas, and California were about to step onto soil most had never heard of. For the Okinawans, it was the day the sky caught fire. American battleships opened their guns. The sound was like the tearing of the world itself, thousands of shells raining on hills that had names once whispered in lullabies. Cattle scattered, houses burst into flame. The air filled with dust, smoke, and the bitter smell of burning sugarcane. When US Marines and soldiers finally came ashore, they were stunned. There was no resistance. The beaches, perfect for defense, were empty. It was quiet enough to hear the waves again. Some American soldiers joked, "Maybe they've all gone home." They hadn't. The Japanese army was waiting inland, dug deep into caves and hills, invisible, prepared for a drawn-out fight. For the civilians trapped between them, that silence was the beginning of hell. They were ordered by Japanese officers to stay underground, to share caves with soldiers, ammunition, and the wounded. Every breath smelled of sweat, fear, and decay. Children cried softly in the dark, told that noise would bring death. In a nearby valley, an old farmer named Taira would later recall, "We lived like ghosts. The ground trembled day and night. We didn't know if it was thunder or the ships, but every shake meant someone was dying." American leaflets began to fall from the sky, small squares of paper fluttering through the smoke. They carried messages in Japanese. "You will be safe if you surrender. Civilians will not be harmed." Some villagers picked them up secretly. Others were too afraid, told that the leaflets were traps meant to mark them for bombing. At night, the sea glowed orange from naval bombardment. Inland, Okinawan families huddled together in caves, whispering prayers they'd learned as children. They didn't yet know that their greatest danger wasn't the Americans coming toward them, but the voices already inside their caves. Because soon, those voices would tell them something terrible. That capture was shame, that surrender was sin, and that the only way left to serve Japan was to die. They didn't fear bullets, they feared lies. Long before the American troops ever set foot on Okinawa, the imperial government had prepared the island for something far darker than invasion's psychological surrender. Every schoolchild knew the slogans, 100 million die together, capture is shameful, the Americans will destroy your honor. Teachers, soldiers, and radio broadcasts repeated the same message until it became truth. Pamphlets warned that US soldiers would torture men, mutilate women, and kill babies. Families practiced suicide drills. Mothers taught how to hold a child close so they could die together in one motion. Some were told to keep knives ready. Others sharpened farming tools. A woman named Uehara remembered years later. "They told us that Americans were beasts, that if we were caught, we'd beg for death. So we promised each other no one would be taken alive." The propaganda didn't come only from the government. Japanese army officers and local collaborators visited villages, standing before crowds to speak of loyalty and sacrifice. They said that those who surrendered would betray the emperor. Those who died, even children, would become spirits guarding Japan's future. To many Okinawans, this wasn't patriotism. It was terror wearing the mask of honor. But there was no choice. The imperial army had brought the war into their homes, and their word was law. In one schoolhouse, a teacher distributed hand grenades to the mothers of his students, one for the enemy, one for themselves. He wept as he handed them out. Most women thanked him through tears. None dared refuse. When US planes dropped food and leaflets promising safety, villagers hid them in shame. To be seen reading American messages was enough to be labeled a traitor. To be accused of spreading doubt could mean death not by the enemy, but by your own people. As the weeks passed, the caves filled not only with fear, but with whispers that the Americans were near, that surrender might be possible, that perhaps the leaflets told the truth. But every whisper was met with a warning: better to die pure than to live as a slave. The words spread like poison, carried by desperate soldiers who had already lost hope of victory. And by the time the American troops reached the southern hills, the civilians had already made their decision. When the Americans came, many wouldn't run. they would climb. The cliffs still echo when the wind hits them just right. Locals say you can hear voices faint, almost like a song carried over the sea. They're not ghosts, they say, just memories that never left. By mid-June 1945, the Battle of Okinawa had become a slaughter. Shells rained day and night. Villages were gone, fields burned, water poisoned. The island that once grew sweet potatoes and hibiscus was now a landscape of ash and bone. In the chaos, entire families began to disappear, not from enemy fire, but by their own hands. At the cliffs of Yaka, mothers held infants close as they stepped toward the edge. At Mabuni, soldiers handed civilians grenades with quiet instructions. One for them, one for you. Some pulled the pin together as families, the explosions swallowed by the roar of distant artillery. Others had no grenade. They chose stones, ropes, or the cliffs. A survivor named Haruko, only 14 then, later recalled, "My mother told me to close my eyes. She pushed me first. I fell on a tree branch and lived. When I opened my eyes, she was gone." Down below, the sea turned red, the waves striking the rocks again and again, carrying pieces of clothing, letters, and children's wooden sandals. American soldiers who later reached those beaches found the bodies of families still clinging to each other, husband, wife, child frozen in embrace. Many of the dead left behind messages scratched into cave walls. "Forgive us. We were told to die. Please tell the Emperor we remained loyal." The tragedy wasn't isolated. It spread from village to village, cave to cave, from Chibichirigama to Itoman. Some families jumped together in silence. Others were driven to it by soldiers' threats. "If you surrender, we will kill you anyway." And yet, even amid the horror, small moments of defiance emerged. A few elders begged the young not to obey. One priest shouted, "The Emperor would not want this," before he was shot by a soldier for spreading American lies. The cliffs became both battlefield and altar, where loyalty to the nation collided with the instinct to protect one's child. And for most, that choice ended the same way, with a fall, with a flash, with the sea closing over them. When American medics finally reached these places, they wept. The fighting had ended, but what they found was not victory. It was silence, the kind that follows when an entire people has already decided to die. But not everyone jumped. Not everyone believed the same story. In the shadows of those caves, a few voices dared to question the command that demanded death. Some mothers whispered, "The Emperor can't want this." Those whispers, small, trembling, and dangerous, became the difference between life and death. By late June, the front lines had collapsed. Japanese officers retreated south, leaving civilians trapped between the caves and the advancing Americans. For many families, the orders were clear: die rather than surrender. But doubt began to spread like a quiet rebellion. In the darkness of one cave, a teacher named Naka thought of her students, the ones who had already jumped. She had been given 2 grenades, but as the explosions echoed outside, she held them tight and asked herself, "If the Americans are monsters, why do they give warnings before they fire? If death is loyalty, why are the soldiers hiding while we die first?" That night, she buried the grenades in the dirt and decided to live. She led a group of children out at dawn, waving a white cloth torn from her kimono. They were captured by US Marines, not tortured, not harmed. Instead, they were given food and water. For the first time in months, they saw sunlight without fear. Across the island, similar stories emerged. Old men carrying wounded wives, children walking barefoot toward the American lines with hands raised, US medics bandaging enemies they couldn't even speak to. One Marine wrote in his diary, "They looked half-starved. We gave them chocolate and water." One woman cried when she realized we weren't going to hurt her. For the Okinawans who survived, it was a moment of unbearable confusion. Everything they had been told, every warning, every slogan fell apart in an instant. The Americans weren't demons, the lies were. Yet even in surrender, the danger didn't end. Some Japanese soldiers, hiding nearby, saw civilians emerging from caves and shouted accusations of betrayal. A few opened fire on their own people. Others threw grenades at families they believed had shamed the emperor. Survivors of those moments carried a guilt that never healed. They lived because they disobeyed. And in post-war Japan, disobedience was still shame. Haruko, the girl who had fallen from the cliff, said decades later, "We didn't live bravely. We just couldn't die like they told us to." But after the war, no one wanted to hear our story. They called us weak. They called us cowards. For years, those who survived hid their memories and their questions. Who gave the order? Who decided that dying was loyalty? And why did the grenades reach every village if no one ever wrote the command? The war would end within days. But the silence surrounding that question, the silence about who ordered death, would last for generations. No written order was ever found. But the grenades came from somewhere. After the war, Japanese officials denied ever commanding civilians to die. They called the suicides spontaneous acts of loyalty. But the testimonies told another story. Survivors from every corner of Okinawa, Yomitan, Itoman, Naha, Shuri, all said the same thing. Japanese soldiers had given them weapons and instructions. Some orders were spoken, some whispered, but all carried the same message. If the enemy comes, take your family and die as subjects of the emperor. A soldier named Sakimoto later confessed in a war crimes hearing, "We were told to preserve national honor. We distributed grenades to civilians. We said one for the enemy, one for yourself." I told them this with tears in my eyes. I thought I was being kind. To the imperial army, death was a gift, the final service a citizen could render to the nation. To the civilians, it was a command disguised as patriotism. There was no single document signed by generals, no written proof of an official order. But the grenades bore the markings of military supply depots, delivered in crates alongside rifles and rations. They did not appear by chance. In the caves near Mabuni, some villagers begged soldiers for protection. Instead, they were handed explosives. One officer said, "The Americans are beasts. You cannot let them touch your women. Die pure." When one mother hesitated, the soldier struck her and shouted, "Do not shame the emperor." After the war, historians and courts in Japan would argue endlessly over whether the government had forced the suicides. But for those who were there, the truth was simpler. The pressure came from every direction: soldiers, teachers, radio broadcasts, and the fear of being called un-Japanese. Even decades later, the pain of that truth tore communities apart. In the 1980s, when textbooks in Japan referred to orders for mass suicide, conservative politicians demanded revisions. They said the phrase "forced suicides" dishonored Japan's soldiers. Survivors protested. They carried banners reading, "We were ordered to die." Some wept in public for the first time in 40 years. One woman, now in her 70s, told a reporter, "When they say no one told us to die, I remember the soldier's face. I remember his voice. I can still smell the metal of the grenade he placed in my hands." That memory, that sound of a pin pulled in obedience, became Okinawa's inheritance. And for every survivor who spoke, another stayed silent, unable to carry the shame of having lived. By the time the last gun fell silent, there was no army left to command. Only the wind, blowing through the caves, where families had once prayed for mercy. June 22nd, 1945, the day Japan's flag came down over Okinawa. But surrender didn't bring peace. It only revealed the cost. June 22nd, 1945, the flag came down, and with it, an entire world. The Battle of Okinawa had lasted 82 days, nearly 3 months of relentless bombardment, starvation, and despair. When it ended, the island was unrecognizable. Nothing moved. Nothing grew. The sea breeze carried only the smell of death. 12,000 Americans were dead. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers were gone. And between them, caught in the middle, lay over 100,000 Okinawan civilians, nearly 1/3 of the island's population. In the southern hills of Mabuni, where the last resistance collapsed, the ground was so thick with the fallen that bulldozers could not pass. American troops buried bodies by the hundreds in mass graves, unable to tell soldier from civilian. Dogs wandered among the ruins, searching for their owners. The rivers ran cloudy, filled with ash and soil. In the caves, survivors emerged slowly thin, hollow-eyed, their skin grey with soot and malnutrition. Many carried infants too weak to cry. They had not seen sunlight in weeks. They didn't know the war was over. American medics handed out water, biscuits, and chocolate bars. One Marine wrote, "They were so small, so quiet. We tried to smile, but some just backed away. They still thought we were going to kill them." To the Americans, Okinawa was victory. To Japan, it was tragedy. But to the Okinawans, it was something neither side understood: the death of an island's soul. Whole villages had vanished from maps. Entire family lines were gone. Their homes turned into craters. A farmer returned to his field and found only a helmet half buried in the mud. He placed flowers beside it and never planted again. The survivors faced new orders, this time from the occupiers. Surrender your weapons, help clear the dead, rebuild. But how do you rebuild when your neighbors are gone, your home is a grave, and your language, your songs, have been silenced? In makeshift camps, mothers searched for missing children. Some were found wandering alone, unable to speak. Others were never found at all. Even the ocean gave back little. The tides had taken most of what the cliffs had claimed. When the first rain of summer fell, it washed the ash into the sea. The island, for the first time in months, smelled clean again. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was exhaustion, the breath of a land that had given everything it had to war. Okinawa was free now, but freedom came with ghosts. And in the decades that followed, those ghosts would speak softly at first, then loud enough for the world to hear. In Okinawa, the war never truly ended, it just went quiet. After 1945, the island was occupied by the United States. Barbed wire fenced off airfields and military zones. Villagers returned to find their farms flattened, their homes gone, their family graves marked only by piles of coral stone. For many, the war had taken everything except the guilt of surviving. Those who had obeyed the orders to die were remembered as heroes. Those who lived were told they had shamed their ancestors. In classrooms and public ceremonies, people spoke of glorious sacrifice. No one spoke of fear. No one dared to say that the emperor's army had told them to kill their own children. For years, survivors hid their memories in silence. Women who had lost families never remarried. Children who had seen their parents jump from the cliffs grew up believing their survival was a mistake. In the villages, people whispered not about what happened, but about who had lived. Even peace became a kind of exile. By the 1950s, Okinawa became America's fortress bases, runways, radar towers. While Japan rebuilt its cities, Okinawa remained under foreign control for nearly 3 decades. The same island that had bled for Japan was now serving the army of its conqueror. And yet, in that uneasy quiet, something began to change. The survivors began to speak. In the 1970s and 80s, as Japan's economic miracle reached its peak, Okinawan elders came forward with diaries, letters, and memories long buried in shame. They told stories of soldiers handing out grenades, of families deceived, of children saved by mercy instead of death. And for the first time, Japan listened, and argued. When Japanese textbooks referred to the forced suicides of Okinawa, nationalists demanded revisions. They said the word forced dishonored Japan's soldiers, but the survivors refused to be silent again. They held signs that read, "We were told to die." They stood before television cameras and named the officers who gave them grenades. Some cried as they spoke. Others simply bowed and said, "Please remember us. We were only farmers. We wanted to live." Today, the cliffs of Yaka and Mabuni are quiet again. Tourists come to see the view, turquoise sea, white spray, and flowers growing where people once fell. On windy days, paper cranes flutter from memorial stones. Children from local schools lay them gently, their teachers explaining what happened not as legend, but as warning. Every year, on June 23rd, Okinawans gather for Ire no Hai, the day of memorial. They bow their heads not only for the dead, but for the truth that they, too, were victims of their own nation's fear. Some bring photographs faded from the Sunday. Others bring folded notes, written in trembling handwriting. To Mother, I still dream of you. To Father, I forgive you. 80 years have passed, but the echoes still remain in the wind that sweeps the cliffs, in the caves that still breathe with salt and memory. And in the question every survivor leaves behind, how could love for one's country be twisted into this? The United States called it strategy, Japan called it honor, but for Okinawa, it was neither. It was survival turned inside out, a tragedy written not in victory or defeat, but in the choices no one should ever have to make. By the end of that spring in 1945, Okinawa was gone, its villages, its voices, its innocence. Yet, what remained was not just loss, it was a warning of what happens when fear becomes loyalty, when obedience replaces truth, and when ordinary people are told that dying is nobler than living. The cliffs of Mabuni and Yaka still stand silent witnesses to a nation's darkest lesson. If you stand there today, you can see the same sea those families saw, the same endless horizon. And if you listen closely, when the wind rises, you might hear it a whisper carried across the waves. Not of death, but of remembrance. We wanted to live. In the decades that followed, Japan rebuilt itself from the ashes, cities shining, factories humming, the war remembered but rarely spoken of. And yet, for Okinawa, the scars never faded, the American bases remained, the graves remained. And every June, when the sirens sound, the island bows its head not in guilt, not in pride, but in grief. Because Okinawa didn't just bleed for Japan. It bled for all of us to remind the world that propaganda can kill more deeply than bullets, and that the greatest enemy in war isn't always the one across the sea. Sometimes it's the voice that tells you dying is duty. As the sun sets over the cliffs, the sea glows gold again. Children play on the same beaches where their grandparents once hid in fear, and in that laughter, in that fragile peace, lives the only victory that truly matters, life itself.